Mrs. Clark has a very organized and structured class. Her students walked in, grabbed materials, and took their seats and began working on their do now sentence frame, which was written on the board. Do nows can either be questions or sentence frames, which help students get ready to work prior to their daily lesson. The do now question on the board today read, character analysis is when you blank. These daily starters take about 5 minutes and are written in student work folders. Following announcements, Mrs. Clark guided students and helped them answer the sentence frame. Character analysis is when you evaluate a character. This strategy was helpful as some students did need a little help getting started. They knew the answer, but they were uncertain as to how to verbalize it. Soon after the do now discussion, Mrs. Clark began a whole group lesson to discuss character analysis and traits. Students opened up their R books and followed along as Mrs. Clark read aloud The Selfish Sister, written by Mimi Ryan. In this short text, the author is discussing the short story, Louisa, Please Come Home, which the students have been working on and reading throughout Workshop 3. Mrs. Clark and her students begin to have a discussion on how the main character in their short story, Louisa, Please Come Home, has a selfish sister named Carol. Throughout the discussion, the students are engaged and participating. Mrs. Clark continues her lesson covering main idea and character traits. She defines the word least by simplifying it to less and even translating it to Spanish, menos, thus demonstrating guided and differentiated instruction. The lesson progressed. Using the selfish sister in their R books, Mrs. Clark guides students to examine the topic sentence, identify detail sentences, analyze language use, and examine the concluding sentence. As students followed Mrs. Clark reading aloud, they underlined the topic sentence, placed a check mark on 2 pieces of supporting details, placed a double underline on 2 direct quotations, circled 3 transition words, and placed a star next to the concluding sentence. Throughout the whole group lesson, the teacher and students had constant discussions regarding the characters of the short story and their traits. Mrs. Clark does a great job at repeating information and providing details. It's a great review for students that have missed something during the lesson or have been absent. There was one part during my observation wherein a student asked the meaning for transition words. Mrs. Clark said, "It's like a cushion in between 2 sentences." She further explained her statement by making reference to the acronym FANBOYS. Some students weren't familiar with the acronym FANBOYS, so Mrs. Clark did a quick mini lesson. FANBOYS is an acronym that helps students learn conjunctions and commas. F is for, A is for and, N is for nor, B is for but, O is for or, Y is for yet, and S is for so. After about 20 minutes into the lesson, a timer goes off. I asked Mrs. Clark about the timer after my observation. She stated that each rotation, including the whole group lesson, is 20 minutes long. The timer helps students to clean up their station and move on to the next station. Shortly after the alarm, Mrs. Clark summed up her lesson, and the students split into 3 different groups. It took students about 1 minute to get situated. One group was at computers, working with the Read 180 software. This group consisted of 6 students. Another group was reading independently at their desks. This group consisted of 5 students. They read books they had selected on their lifestyle level and were working on their quick writes. Quick writes are worksheets that include questions and or graphic organizers for students to complete on the books they have selected to read. The third group was working on their R books and continuing the whole group lesson only in a smaller group setting. This group had 4 students. Mrs. Clark was providing more individualized instruction at this station. She discussed analyzing plot, all the characters and their traits in the short story, Louisa, Please Come Home. While the teacher was working with a small group, 2 students had trouble with their headphones at the computer station. They did not disturb the teacher at all. They made several attempts to solve this problem on their own, and they did so eventually. While all this is taking place, Mrs. Clark continues to discuss character traits and vocabulary words like protagonist and antagonist. As the students in the small group had a discussion amongst each other regarding analyzing characters, Mrs. Clark steps away to pass out progress reports. This distracted all the students, just for a bit. They began to discuss and share their grades. As soon as Mrs. Clark was done and returned to the small group, everyone got back on track at their stations. Mrs. Clark began to help a student in RTI. He was having a difficult time focusing. Mrs. Clark began to help him to get back on track. He seemed to be a little in his own little world. He was focused on playing with his pencil and paper. He dropped his folder on the floor and left it there for quite some time. He seemed very entertained with this paper and pencil. But I was quite surprised that he was actually paying attention and continued to answer questions and participate with the lesson. Approximately 5 minutes before class was over, Mrs. Clark had students clean up. The students knew where to place their items and did so neatly. They were excited to leave and discuss their grades. A few students stayed behind to help Mrs. Clark clean up. During my observation, the students were very engaged. Even one student who was continuously talking and trying to get the teacher's attention was listening and participating. Mrs. Clark did not let this student distract her or keep her from teaching. She was patient and understanding. Mrs. Clark walked the classroom and checked in on all groups throughout the entire class period. She differentiated instruction during whole and small group lessons by helping students connect reading to writing as she read aloud The Selfish Sister. She guided students in examining the topic sentence, identifying detailed sentences, analyzing language use, and examining the concluding sentence. During each step of this literary analysis, the students underlined, checked, circled, and placed stars to help identify each feature. This is a great strategy for visual learners. She repeated information, explained a few things in Spanish, and even simplified terms, all strategies used to help the auditory learner and ELL. It was very different observing a teacher as an administrator. I caught myself paying more attention to her instructional strategies, which I'm certain are routine for her. She has a knack for effortlessly differentiating instruction and quickly changing instructional strategies. It was a pleasure to observe Miss Clark's classroom and the flow of things. Mrs. Clark and Read 180 are doing wonderful things for our students and our school.